Hey folks, welcome back. In this section, we're going to talk about deployment concepts with EC2, and we'll also talk a great deal about elastic load balancers. So if we look in our DevOps doctrine, let's go into deployment concepts with EC2. All right, in our scenario, a DevOps engineer will be required to work with EC2 instances, and a key task will be using various techniques to back up EC2 instances. Likewise, Elastic Load Balancer as a part of deployments will be a common tool in the DevOps engineer's toolset. The ability to configure ELBs securely with appropriate health checks and to configure logging will be required both professionally and as a demonstrable skill on the DevOps Professional Certification exam. If we look at our menu, we're going to be talking about using IAM roles with EC2. We're going to be talking about Elastic Load Balancer and EC2 logging, and there is a difference, and you can use both actually. We'll be talking about health checks, and health checks are very helpful in troubleshooting. We'll talk a little bit about ELB security and EC2 backup strategies. So, looking at our diagram, we're going to be working with elastic load balancers, EC2 instances, multiple EC2 instances. There can also be an auto-scaling group creating these instances. And as far as backups, we're going to be looking at EBS storage as well as S3 buckets. Now, with S3 buckets, you have a great deal of versatility. There are a lot of things you can do. Our lesson on IAM roles with EC2, oftentimes the scenario is that you are storing some sort of credential in your S3 bucket. And rather than passing around access keys, using IAM roles, launching an instance with an IAM role, and delegating access to this S3 bucket is a common solution to this issue. So in this first lesson, we're going to talk about using IAM roles with EC2. Applications must sign their API requests with AWS credentials. So you need a strategy for managing credentials for your applications that run on EC2 instances. IAM roles allow your applications to securely make API requests from your instances. And again, the key is by using an IAM role, you're able to, from an EC2 instance, more importantly from applications within these instances, you can access S3, you can access RDS databases, but the key is that you are not passing around credentials. Another no-no is you are not hard coding these credentials in your software applications. So IAM roles solve this problem. Now, looking at our diagram, we create an IAM role and we give this IAM role S3 privileges. And then we can launch an EC2 instance with this IAM role. Now, if we're talking about instances within an auto-scaling group, and we've seen this in previous lessons, we can put this role in our launch configuration. So any instance that launches from the launch configuration will have this IAM role. And again, this IAM role will facilitate accessing this S3 bucket. Now let's look at some of the key concepts in this process. So again, applications must sign their API requests with AWS credentials. You can securely distribute your credentials to the instances, enabling the applications on those instances to use your credentials to sign requests. And you can protect your credentials from other users. You must also be able to update the credentials on each instance when you rotate your AWS credentials. IAM roles allow you to securely make API requests from your instances without requiring you to manage the security credentials that the applications use, and that's a key point. So these key concepts are here for you to be able to study. I'm not going to recite all of them. That would be a bit tedious for you guys. So when we talk about common use cases, let's just think of the general premise first of all. So we have some vital information that we want to store securely, and we want specific users or applications to be able to retrieve those credentials. And that's where IAM roles come into play. Let's say we want to store database credentials in S3. So we use an IAM role on an EC2 instance to retrieve those database credentials. And then with those credentials, we can access the database. Likewise, storing temporary credentials, storing access keys in S3, and we can retrieve those with IAM roles. Store your configuration files for bootstrapping EC2 instances in S3. And then again, we can use IAM roles to retrieve those config files. So again, there's a good bit of information on this page for your perusal. Now let's go back to the main page for IAM roles with EC2. And we're going to go ahead and step through a hands-on example. We're going to create an IAM role, and we're going to define which accounts or AWS services can assume the role. And then we're going to define the API actions and resources the application can use after assuming the role. And we're going to work with an S3 bucket. And then we're going to launch an EC2 instance with this role. Now again, we'll just work with a single EC2 instance, but we can also do this with an auto-scaling group, and we would specify the role that we create in our launch configuration. Now, typically, when all of this is set up, you're going to have an application running on an instance or instances that can then retrieve this role. Now, we're not going to take it that far, but we will SSH into an EC2 instance and verify that we can access the information in our S3 bucket. So it's just another step to have your application, say a Python application, access the information in this bucket. Okay, let's first go into IAM. And we're going to create a role, and we select AWS service, and we want it for EC2, and we'll go to permissions. Now, we want this service, we want this role to have S3 access. So let's just do a search on S3, and full access, read and write, that's fine. Let's do that. And we just need to give it a name. We'll just call it S3 for DevOps. And then we can create a role with full S3 access. Now, let's go over to EC2, and we're going to create two instances. One instance with the role and one instance without the role. T2 micro is fine. So, the first instance, we are not going to attach a role to the instance. So let's go ahead and launch. And let's create a new key pair. We'll call it S3 without. Download the key pair. And launch the instance. Now, while this instance is launching, let's go ahead and create our second instance. Again, Amazon Linux AMI, T2 micro, configure instance details, and S3 for DevOps. We are going to attach this role to our instance. Let's review and launch. And let's create a new key pair. And we will call this S3 WIT. And if anybody knows about Philly cheesesteaks, that's kind of a play on that. Look those cheesesteaks up if you don't. All right, so let's download this key pair and launch our instances. And let's view instances. Okay, so the instance without the IAM role is going to be ready before the instance with the role. So let's grab the connection information. We'll actually grab the connection information for both. We can just paste into a document so that we have them for our use. Let's also grab the SSH for our instance with the role. Now, one of the things I did in preparation for this lesson was to create an S3 bucket. And that S3 bucket, I just created a couple folders in the bucket. We will just kind of do a before and after. With the EC2 instance that doesn't have the role, we will attempt to access the bucket. And then with the instance that does have the role, we will attempt to access the bucket. And this is just a general test to ensure that everything is working right. Again, the final step would be, which we're not going to do in the lesson, is to actually retrieve information from the S3 bucket, usually via an application on the EC2 instance. Okay, so both of our instances have passed their status checks and are ready. So I'm going to finish this lesson from a terminal window. Okay, at the management. All right, add a terminal window. Now, we're going to SSH into the EC2 instance that does not have an IAM role attached to it. So first thing I'm going to do is just change the permissions on my key pair so that only I can use the key pair. And I want to make sure that I'm in the downloads folder. All right, now we can SSH into that instance. All right, so we are into the instance. Now, let's do an Aws Configure. Now let's do an AWS Configure. All right, now here's a key point. The access key and the secret access key I'm using is for a user who has absolutely no privileges to S3. So the only way such a user is going to be able to access S3 is if this instance has an IAM role, which gives permission to S3. And I'm just going to set, I'm using US West 2 as my default region. Default output format, I'll just new line through that. All right, so we are in the instance without the IAM role. And again, this user has absolutely no S3 permissions. We need to set our context. And then we want to try to list the contents of our S3 bucket. Access denied. And that is as expected. Again, this user has no privileges to S3, and there's no IAM role on the instance giving access to S3. Let's exit out of this instance. So we're back in the download folder. And before we do anything, let's change the permissions on our key pair. And let's SSH into our instance. And again, we'll attempt to access the S3 bucket. And there are two folders within this bucket. And there we go, test folder 1 and test folder 2. So as you can see, for this user with no S3 access, the EC2 instance that has the S3 role provided access to the S3 bucket. So again, the final piece to this would really be an application that accesses the S3 bucket and retrieves whatever critical information you place in that bucket. Could be user credentials, database credentials. It could be config files for bootstrapping. But anytime you have a use case where you need to store information securely and you want to provide access to the information without using access keys, without passing around credentials, think of this solution. Think of an EC2 instance with an IAM role that you give S3 access to, and of course you'll create an S3 bucket and place the critical information in the bucket. So we've completed this lesson. Go ahead and mark it complete, and let's move on to the next.